Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. Today we're going to be talking about something a little different. We've been focusing really heavy on the American Civil War, the Revolution, the First and Second World Wars, but today I want to go all the way back to the 14th and 15th centuries and talk about something that is a big interest of mine, probably second only to the American Civil War in terms of my historical interest, and that is the Wars of the Roses. Now, this is a website called, or a YouTube channel called Feature History, and they've done kind of a 12-minute segment on the Wars of the Roses, so I thought this would be a good short video to kind of react to and maybe fill in some of the gaps. If you don't know a lot about the Wars of the Roses, I highly encourage you to read up about it and learn more. There's a lot of great fiction or historical fiction or even kind of almost docudrama out there about this. Things like the White Prince, or the White Princess, the White Queen, they are set during this time. Even the Tudors kind of takes place just after the events of the Wars of the Roses. Very, very interesting time in world history and especially in British history. So we're going to take a look at it, and I'll try to fill in some of the gaps as we go along. Please don't forget, watch all the way through, leave a comment, drop a like if you would, and as always, please subscribe. We are probably going to go over 3,000 subscribers today, which is awesome. Been averaging about 200 to 300 subscribers a day. When we hit 5,000 subscribers, I'm going to be doing the first of what I hope will be regular giveaways on the channels. I haven't decided what that giveaway will be yet, but I'm open to suggestions, so drop a comment in there if you've got a suggestion of something I could give away on the channel, but I want to make that a regular part of this. So let's go ahead and dive into Feature History's War of the Roses. They call it War of the Roses, but technically it should be called Wars of the Roses. Okay.
Domestic disputes. Like an elaborate episode of Dr. Phil, the War of the Roses offers us a chance to watch and enjoy some good old family squabbles. It's all fun and games until 50,000 people die.
And that's an understatement, because there were that many people that died in just one or two of the battles. But if you're a fan of Game of Thrones, I forgot to mention this, you'll notice a lot of parallels here. I think Game of Thrones was directly inspired by a lot of the events of the Wars of the Roses.
Hello and welcome to Feature History, featuring the War of the Roses, an epic century-long civil war that pitted brother against brother, father against son, and fifth cousin once removed against fifth cousin once removed, all for the grand prize of the English throne, because it was very, very comfortable. It brought dynasties to an end, impacted wars that would change history forever, ended the medieval era, and had two absolutely gorgeous flowers. I hope the edge of your seat is extra cushioned, because we're going on a ride of drama. Our story begins in the late 14th century and carries to the 15th century. These two centuries were characterized in crisis. Famines, plagues, and the start of the adorably named Little Ice Age would bring Europe to its knees. With near-apocalyptic-like destruction at the hands of Mother Nature, war and revolt would become commonplace. Ever since William the Conqueror indulged in his namesake and conquered England in 1066, the ruling dynasties of France and England had been closely interlinked. It would typically lead to skirmish, but in 1337 the game would change. King Edward III of England believed he was the rightful heir to the throne of France, and
I think Edward III probably was the rightful heir of France, especially after Philip died. And if you look at the history of it, he definitely had a very strong claim to that throne. And in fact, for good periods of English history in the 1200s, England actually controlled more, the King of England controlled more of France than the King of France did, because of all the other claims, Anjou, Aquitaine, things like that, that were actually inherited by the English king.
Philip IV challenged England's territorial claims. Edward responded by attempting to take the throne of France, beginning the 100 Years' War. Edward III's eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, was heir to the popular king and made good impressions with his success in the war against France. Those campaigns would take their toll though and kill the prince in 1376 by giving him a nasty case of the shits.
Yeah, pretty much. So Edward III, probably one of the greatest kings in English history, and I think more people would probably know him as such if it hadn't been for the fact that right in the middle of his reign, the plague hit and killed something like 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Europe and just devastated England. Not only England as a nation, but England's economy in particular. Imagine if suddenly 1/3 of all the farmers are gone, 1/3 of all the craftsmen are gone, 1/3 or even half of all the tradesmen are gone. This just destroyed the economy because you can't produce everything you need. So it was devastating to the economy. But Edward III, great king, which was important because he followed his father, who was a very bad king. And unfortunately, it kind of went back and forth that way. And unfortunately, the Black Prince died. And if you've ever seen the movie A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger, the Black Prince is a part of that movie, played by James Purefoy. He kind of has a couple of cameo appearances in the movie, but he's portraying the Black Prince, who is the son of Edward III.
Though Edward III had 3 other living sons to take up the position of king.
Well, it wasn't
John,
their job.
Duke of Lancaster, Edmund, Duke of York, and Thomas, Duke of Gloucester. Edward III died a year on from his eldest in 1377, and the throne was left to Richard II, the son of the Black Prince, passing an entire generation imposing a middle finger to the sons.
Yeah, that said, though, that's how inheritance worked. If there was a son who, in this case, the Black Prince was the Prince of Wales, and he died before his father, then if he had children, the throne passes to them. That's just, that's kind of how it works. So that really wasn't that big a deal. It's happened many other times. It happened with King George III was the grandson of the previous king. Another example would be Queen Victoria, who was the daughter of the 4th son of George III, even though she still had uncles who were still living.
Richard was 10 when he took on the family business, and the sons deemed him maybe not the best choice for this kind of thing. His reign was considered by most to be the work of a child, which is exactly what it was.
And here's the thing, none of what comes later, none of what would become the Wars of the Roses would have even happened if Richard had been a good king. He's a child when he takes the throne, but he is still king when he's an adult, and by all indications was not a very good ruler. And if you're familiar with the Shakespeare play, you know how that all plays out. It's kind of a fictionalized version of it. But had Richard been a good king, we're not even talking about this right now. The only reason that he was overthrown and all of this stuff comes about is because of the power vacuum that was left by his lack of leadership.
As well as not being a favourite with peasantry, he was hated by the nobility.
Yep.
Thomas attempted to undermine the king, and he led a coalition of powerful nobles against Richard in 1388, which saw the king's power significantly handicapped. This would set a trend for the near century to follow. One notable noble in that group was Henry, son of John, and so naturally carrying on the name of Lancaster.
Bolingbroke.
He, Thomas, and the others were satisfied in their victory, and so would rest easy for a decade.
So Henry, they call him Henry Bolingbroke because of where he was from. It was a pretty common thing then that you would name somebody based on where they were born.
Well, not too easy, they were still at war with France. Richard would inevitably strike back against this, and he did in 1397 by dissolving Thomas's coalition and arresting him, and also probably getting Thomas de Morbray to murder him too. Henry was spared the prison time and good old medieval shanking. Despite mercy, Henry was not happy with this turn of events and came into conflict with Morbray, eventually challenging the man to a duel of honour. Morbray accepted, but Richard intervened, banishing them both and upsetting the nobility, fearing they were losing their rights to the interventionist king. Whilst Henry was banished, his father, John, passed away in 1399. Richard held John's holdings and titles, keeping them from Henry. Henry was sufficiently fed up with Richard. Given there was no HR to file a complaint to, he decided to instead amass an army and invade England while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, seizing control in his absence. Upon Richard's return, he took the glorious route of giving himself up and going to prison. And dying. Henry became king.
Alright, so they kind of skip over that, but imagine for a second, you're Henry IV. You've just usurped the throne. And it's not even like Henry was next in line to the throne. There were other people who were ahead of him in line to the throne. In fact, that's where the problem is going to come later, because the Dukes of York had a stronger claim to the throne than the Dukes of Lancaster did. But Henry has seized the throne, but the old king's still out there, even though he has abdicated the throne. And if you know anything throughout history, you don't leave a threat to your rule alive, whether they're a former king or just somebody else who could claim the throne. And so Richard was, let's just say, allowed to die with a little bit of help. Probably starved to death is most likely what happened.
Henry IV and the Red Rose of Lancaster was established on the throne. Despite minor unrest, Lancaster rule endured, passing on from Henry IV to the V, who then indulged the whole death part of war in 1422, leaving his only infant son, Henry VI.
So Henry V, to kind of gloss over that, one of the greatest kings, again, in English history. He's the one that everybody remembers for the glorious victory at the Battle of Agincourt. He's the one who gives the speech in Shakespeare's play about band of brothers. We happy few, we band of brothers, for he who sheds his blood with me today will be my brother, that whole thing. But yeah, Henry V then dies at the age of like 35 and leaving his like 9-month-old son, Henry VI. Interestingly, Henry V did conquer France. And he conquered France to the point where his wife, who was actually, I think, the daughter of the King of France, or maybe a sister, I don't remember. But his wife, basically through her then, Henry VI is the heir to the English throne and the French throne. Catherine of Valois was the mother's name. And unfortunately, he's a baby, Henry VI, when he comes to the throne, and that's the least of Henry VI's problems. He, again, had Henry VI been a good king and been of sound mind, Wars of the Roses probably don't happen.
To take up the throne. The young boy spent his early years in the regency of several noblemen, most importantly Richard, the Duke of York, the great-grandson of Edward III. When the weak-willed Henry became of age, he was convinced to marry the stunning, beautiful, and power-hungry French Margaret of Anjou. When Margaret arrived at Henry's court, she distrusted York and would constantly attempt to separate Henry from his staunch general. She proposed instead the talents of the Duke of Somerset, who happened to be one of her supporters, and also Lancaster. She continued to push York out of the picture, removing him from the front lines and instead to Ireland, where he could not play any role in the proceedings of the court. She instead gave York's former post to Somerset, who one could charitably say was not that good. The mounting failures of Margaret and her cronies mixed with excessive corruption left them widely unpopular by 1450, and what of the man meant to actually be running the show? Henry was viewed as beyond incompetent. York would return and prematurely march on London, demanding for Somerset's imprisonment. York was imprisoned until he would finally humble himself.
Now here's the thing too. York has a stronger claim to the throne than the actual king does. If anyone was actually the rightful king, it was the Duke of York. He had a stronger claim both through his male line, but also through the most direct descent from King Edward III. But of course, that whole usurpation thing with Henry IV had happened. Meanwhile, while all of this is going on, and I don't know if he'll touch on this or not, Catherine of Valois, who is Henry VI's mother, has a relationship with a young, very kind of not noble guy by the name of Tudor, and has 3 children with him. And one of those children eventually will become the ancestor of the Tudor dynasty. I'm sure they'll talk more about that.
Before the court and swear loyalty to Henry in 1453. Civil discontent grew to uncontrollable levels, and those responsible would have to be held as such. York and his Yorkist faction strived for Margaret, Somerset, and their Lancaster accomplices' power to be revoked and their influence removed. That opportunity would be offered to them later the same year. Henry's failures led to defeat in the 100 Years' War, and his rational reaction was to have an absolute mental breakdown. A regency was set up in the king's mental absence, and the popular York was to take up the title of Lord Protector. York quickly got down to business and placed Somerset in prison and began to implement reforms. Before he could appreciate his work though, Henry managed to recuperate to his wife shrieking of how York is ruining everything. York's position was revoked, his reforms reversed, and Somerset released. York, alongside his ally, the wealthy Earl of Warwick, knew the Queen surely had it in for them now, and so rose their armies in the north of England in hopes of deposing Lancastrian power by force. The War of the Roses would begin on the 22nd of May 1455, when the White Rose of York combated the Red Rose of Lancaster in the First Battle of St. Albans. The battle would end in a decisive Yorkist victory and Somerset's death. Henry was...
So every time there's one of these battles, and the Wars of the Roses were not 30 constant years of battle. There was a battle or two here, and then peace for a year or two, and then another big battle, and then peace for 5 years, and then another big battle, and peace for 10 years. It was really spread out, but every time one of these battles happens, you have all of the nobles on the losing side rounded up and, for the most part, executed. And so if you look throughout the history of the Wars of the Roses, pretty much every head of every household, every major noble family is killed, and even some of his heirs are killed, and sometimes multiples. The Duke of York is killed. His eldest son, or second eldest son, is killed. 3 of his sons eventually die during this period as well. Two of them end up being kings.
He was captured by York, and his release was negotiated on terms that York would have his title of Lord Protector returned to him. Henry, being a poor loser, would once again suffer a bout of mental dysfunction for a period of months. He would recover once again to his wife's demands for York's disposal and would once again comply. This would cause York and Warwick to fear for their lives, as this time they felt Margaret would come down hard on their descent, and so would flee the country and go their separate ways in 1459. Margaret had them labelled as traitors and attempted to see to their arrest. York would stay in hiding as Warwick took the grander approach of defending his fortress in Calais and launching raids against the Lancasters. In 1460, Warwick turned it up a notch by straight up invading England and taking London and Kent to much applause.
And the Earl of Warwick is thereafter, once all of this is done, known as the Kingmaker, and you'll kind of see why as we go along.
York and Warwick were far more popular than the corrupt Margaret and obedient Henry. The Battle of Northampton soon after Warwick's landing would see him meet the Lancastrian challenge and defeat it, capturing Henry. Again. York returned to England after Warwick did all the hard stuff so that he could assert his claim to the throne, having himself and his children designated as heir to the throne upon Henry's death. Margaret was livid. The only reason she came to this godforsaken island was for her beautiful child, Prince Edward, to become King Edward. She struck a deal with the King of Scotland for an army, and once she had that army, she raised hell across the counties of England. York and his second eldest Edmund met their end at the end of a pike, when attempting to face Margaret Scots in the Battle of Wakefield and later.
And this was a really ridiculous battle because York did not have to lose this battle. He actually rode out of a protected position in a castle and ended up getting himself captured and beheaded. His son, the Earl of Rutland, was actually killed by a man named John Clifford, who happens to be one of my ancestors, so that's kind of my own personal tie to the story. I highly recommend, by the way, if you have the opportunity to do family history research. I've been doing it for 25 years. It's so cool to find your own personal connections to the history. So whenever I study the Wars of the Roses, I feel myself siding with the Yorks because they had the greater claim. But at the same time, understanding that my own personal family connection was on the Lancaster side with John Clifford.
Late 1460, she continued her campaign southward, beating back Warwick in the Second Battle of St. Albans and discovering her husband sitting quietly beneath a tree. After achieving the bargaining peace that was her husband, she retreated to the north to consolidate, leaving London without any king. The late York's eldest, Edward, would meet with Warwick and his surviving men and enter London. The Bishop of London would talk with the boy and then ask the people of London for their judgment. The crowds would shout back, "King Edward."
Edward
As
IV.
de facto King Edward IV's goal was to remove Henry from power. He and Warwick would pursue Margaret's army and meet them outside York in the Battle of Towton on the 29th of March 1461. They fought a brutal battle accompanied by a blizzard and a dramatic narrative of revenge. In the end, 28,000 men lay dead and Edward stood the victor.
Battle of Towton, I believe, was probably the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Just a brutal battle, and archaeology to this day is bearing that out. They've been finding bodies from the Battle of Towton, just brutal battle wounds, and you could tell just how awful. And this battle went the better part of a day. It was fought in a snowstorm. It was just imagine everything you could think of about a brutal medieval battle, and that's what Towton was.
It appeared as if Edward had finally ended the War of the Roses and a Yorkist victory. But if that was so, I'd be rolling pictures now and talking about how the war was significant as some faff, but I'm not. Warwick started negotiations for Edward's marriage to a French princess early, seeking to secure power for Edward. He was betrayed to discover that Edward had fallen in love with a widow and married her in secret. Warwick knew that Edward was far too ignorant of politics and deemed that he must right the wrong he had made. He threw away his ties to the Yorks and decided to instead side with the Lancasters.
Now, that skips over a lot of what happened here, but when he decides to marry Catherine Woodville, initially a lot of people think that he really didn't intend to, because Edward IV was a bit of a playboy. He liked to sleep around, and sometimes when a woman would play hard to get because she wanted to protect her virtue, he'd make promises about wanting to marry her and stuff like that. And people think that maybe that's what he did with her, and he had previously done with a woman named Eleanor Butler, which would come back after Edward's death to become a major problem. But he marries Catherine Woodville. She's a commoner. She's also the widow of a Lancastrian knight by the name of Grey, and had several children by him already. And she's also the daughter of a Burgundian duchess. and that would actually play in later because Burgundy would become allies with the House of York. But it was years after all of this before the Earl of Warwick actually turns against King Edward IV and sides with his brother George and trying to put George on the throne, and then later on trying to put Henry VI back on the throne.
Warwick reached out to Edward's envious brother, George, and sailed to
The
France
Duke of
to create an
Clarence.
allegiance with his former mortal enemy, Margaret, on the request of the French king. After multiple marriages and several handshakes, a plot to depose Edward IV was in place. Warwick invaded...
So George actually marries the Earl of Warwick's daughter. And George is the one who very famously was executed by being drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. That's again something they kind of show a lot of in The White Princess, or The White Queen.
England in 1470 as Edward attempted to suppress the Lancaster rebellions. Catching his former friend off guard, Edward was forced to flee. He chose to accompany himself with his youngest brother and loyal supporter, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Warwick decided to now toe the party line and use Henry IV, placing him back on the throne and offending George. George's whole motivation was to take the throne for himself, not to bring back the old guard. Make no mistake, Henry might have been on the throne, but it was Warwick calling the shots. Warwick had England befriend France and was tempted into a war against Burgundy, which proved to be a fatal mistake. Charles of Burgundy would offer the estranged Edward the funds to take back his throne, and so Edward would go to war. Edward invaded in 1471 and would meet his brother George, who would beg for forgiveness. Forgiveness he would be given.
Yep.
Edward then confronted Warwick's army in thick fog and, using the confusion to his advantage, defeated the outnumbering force in the Battle of Barnet and slaying Warwick. Margaret arrived on the Isle at the very same day only to hear of Warwick's demise. She decided to cast her lot and her men and confront Edward in the Battle of Tewkesbury. Edward proved the superior commander. Prince Edward, the cruel child, was killed and his mother taken captive by the Yorks. It was only by a ransom paid by the French king would she return home. The father would meet the same fate as the son. Henry VI was murdered soon after the battle, finally removing the Lancaster problem.
So there's a lot of debate about that. After the Battle of Tewkesbury, of course, the Prince Edward was killed, Prince of Wales. Margaret goes back to France. Henry VI is finally killed in the Tower of London. Some people say that it was actually Edward IV himself who did it by smothering him with a pillow. Some people say, it was the evil Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was future Richard III. But I think the most likely thing is that he was actually hit over the back of the head. In fact, I believe sometime later they had exhumed his body and found that the hair was kind of matted to the back of the skull from how bad he had been hit in the head.
York power was restored and the War of the Roses has finally ended in a Yorkist psych. Whilst the remainder of Edward's rule was fine, the problem of succession were bound to crop up. Upon Edward's sudden death in 1483, his son's succession was prevented by Edward's once loyal brother, Richard. See, there was a point to me mentioning him. Richard claimed that due to Edward's secret marriage, none of his children were legitimate, and so had the princes conveniently disappeared.
So it wasn't really, I don't think, a secret marriage to Eleanor Butler. It was a contract for marriage, which in those times was as good as a marriage. It was like a betrothal. And you needed to actually get a divorce or a papal dispensation to get out of such a contract. So it was a problem. And if they could prove it, it meant that Edward IV's children with Catherine Woodville were illegitimate and therefore couldn't inherit the throne. And that's really what this was about. This was a fight between Richard and the Woodvilles. And they don't mention it, but Catherine Woodville's, I think her brother and her father had been killed by the Earl of Warwick during that last bit in 1470, 1471. And so now these princes in the Tower, as they're called, King Edward V, who succeeds his father, as well as the younger brother Richard, just kind of disappear from the Tower. Nobody really knows for sure what happened to him.
Yeah, so he considers behind on the throne of England. Richard III's mad and blatant power grab shocked onlookers, but surely no one remained to challenge his claim. That was the case until the discovery of Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian descendant of Edward III. Raised in exile on the sunny shores of France, Henry would cross the Channel in 1485 and confront the defrauding king in the Battle of Bosworth Field. Henry managed to defeat Richard's superior army and killed the man himself, leaving Henry the only one to claim the throne.
I don't know that that's true. I've never read any historical context in which they've said that Henry Tudor actually killed Richard himself. It was a fight between the retainers of both men. Richard III had the stronger fight, or the stronger army, and there was a third army that kind of on the side. If you've seen in Game of Thrones, the Battle of the Bastards, they call it. And it looks like Jon Snow's side is losing the battle when all of a sudden the Knights of the Vale kind of ride in to the rescue at the last minute. I think that was inspired by the Battle of Bosworth, because there's this third army who's actually controlled by Henry Tudor's stepfather, the Stanleys. And the Stanleys had not declared for one side or the other. And so they kind of sat back watching what would happen. And there's this dramatic moment where the Stanleys ride in on the side of Henry Tudor and turn the tide of the battle. And Richard, hoping to try to bring an end to the battle, he rides down to try and get at Henry Tudor and kill him in single combat. But one of Henry Tudor's bannermen actually kills him.
To extend the olive branch, or to stop a bloody rebellion, probably the latter, he would marry the daughter of Edward IV, finally uniting the two roses to become the House of Tudor and bringing a little bit of peace to a tiny old island called Britain. With the end of the war also brought an end to the medieval era in England. The power shift caused by the Black Death in part had finally ceased, and England became far more centralised under Henry VII. Henry's dynasty would pave the way for the English Reformation and the unification of England and Scotland under James I. Some say the significance of the War of the Roses is exaggerated, and the war really meant very little in the grand scheme of it all. And to them I say...
So, yeah, Wars of the Roses, just a brilliant time in history, and it does go back a good 100 years or so, and the effects of that were felt for a good while afterwards. And so Henry Tudor marries Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, and since her brothers were dead, technically the heir to the Yorkist claim to the throne. And she probably had, a more legitimate claim to the throne than her husband Henry VII did. But one thing is for sure is that Henry VIII was the heir to all of the claims to the throne, the York side, the Lancaster side. So there was no doubt anymore who the rightful heir was, because Henry VIII was that heir no matter which side you chose. But the Wars of the Roses continued to be felt even during Henry VIII's reign. Late in his reign, he had a woman named Margaret executed. Margaret was actually the daughter of George, the Duke of Clarence, who had been Edward IV's brother that had been drowned in the Malmsey wine after rebelling against his brother. But that's a lot more than I can really kind of cover effectively in all of this, but I would love to hear your thoughts about the Wars of the Roses, your thoughts about any of the events that we've just talked about, and I highly suggest that you dig into this period in history. There's a lot of great documentaries on YouTube about it. There's a lot of great TV shows, like I mentioned, The White Queen, The White Princess. Very, very good. If you want to learn more about this time, let me know your thoughts, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.